Megan always had a thing for the finer things in life. That's how we found ourselves at this swanky new restaurant in town, the kind of place with more Michelin stars than I could wrap my head around. She'd been dropping hints for weeks, going on about how we needed to celebrate something, even though there wasn't any special occasion, no birthday, no anniversary, nothing like that. When I finally asked her what we were celebrating, she just flashed that picture-perfect smile, lipstick and all, and said, "Sometimes you gotta treat yourself, just because." I wasn't bothered by it. I loved seeing her happy, and truth be told, after a rough few months of feeling distant, I hoped this night would bring us back together. But from the moment we sat down, something felt off. Megan kept glancing around, like she was looking for someone. Her laugh was louder than usual, and her jokes seemed a little forced. Then her phone rang. The ringtone was different this time, kind of soft and eerie. I watched as her whole expression shifted, her bright smile faded, and without even looking at me, she grabbed her phone and hurried off, mumbling something about work. Now, Megan worked at an art gallery. It's not exactly the kind of job where emergencies happen at 9:30 at night. Still, she seemed nervous, like she didn't want me hearing whatever was going on. As she disappeared from sight, a knot formed in my gut, one that had been tightening for a while. 5 minutes turned into 10, and I finally got up. I wasn't trying to be nosy. I just couldn't understand why she'd leave me sitting there in a room full of strangers while she whispered into her phone. I made my way toward the bathroom area, sticking to the shadows of the dim hallway that led to the exit. That's when I spotted her, standing just outside the entrance. Her back was to me, one hand clenched around her phone, a finger pressed to her ear. "Listen, I told you I'm busy tonight. I can't." "No, I said I'd take care of it. Just give me more time." "Take care of what?" I froze, staying just out of sight, my heart thudding in my chest. Megan sounded desperate, almost like she was pleading. Then there was silence, and I saw her shoulders tense up, her head dropping slightly. "No, he doesn't know anything," she said, her voice softer now. "I've kept it hidden, just like we agreed." Before I heard anything else, I backed away and headed to the restroom. I turned on the faucet and splashed water on my face, staring at myself in the mirror. Hidden? Hidden what? My mind raced through all sorts of wild ideas, each one more far-fetched than the last. But the darkest thoughts just stuck there, heavy in my chest. When I finally returned to the table, Megan was already back, her phone tucked neatly in her purse. That same bright smile was back on her face, like nothing had happened. "Sorry, babe," she said with a casual shrug. "Work stuff. You know how it is." I nodded, forcing a smile, but the rest of the night passed in a blur. I watched her sip her wine, her fingers twirling around the stem of the glass, but all I could hear in my head were those words. "He doesn't know anything." That night, when we got home, Megan went straight to bed, saying she was exhausted. I stayed up in the living room, sitting in the dark. I had to know what she was hiding. This wasn't something I could just let go. So, I did something I'd never done before. I grabbed her laptop. She usually stayed up late working on it, claiming she was dealing with gallery finances or exhibition plans, stuff I never really asked much about. But tonight, it was just sitting there, and my curiosity got the best of me. I opened it, and there it was, an email inbox under a name that wasn't hers, some alias. The first few emails seemed normal, stuff about paintings and sales. But then I found one with the subject line, "Funds transferred," and my stomach dropped. $10 million, hidden across several accounts, none of them showing her real name. The email chain went back years, and each message felt like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about the money. There was something deeper going on, something Megan had kept from me for a long, long time. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was her smile, hear her laugh, and then that email about $10 million flashed in my mind. How had she hidden something so big, right under my nose? None of it made sense. She wasn't some heiress, and she wasn't some kind of financial genius. I knew what we made, and while we were doing all right, we sure as hell weren't millionaires. When she woke up the next morning, I acted like everything was normal. I made coffee, kissed her on the cheek as she walked into the kitchen. "Morning, babe," she said, still sounding groggy, her usual flawless act back in place. My hand shook as I handed her the coffee mug. She didn't even notice. All I knew was that I needed answers. But I had to play it smart. Megan had been keeping this secret for years, and the way she whispered into that phone made me realize it wasn't just any secret. It was something deeper, maybe even dangerous. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more proof. So, I called in sick to work and spent the whole day digging. Every moment she was out of the house, I was on her laptop, diving into her emails, her bank accounts. And it wasn't just one account. There were multiple accounts, spread out across different banks, all under different aliases. The transactions? The last few were recent, big chunks of money being moved from one place to another, but with no clear destination or trail I could easily follow. But it wasn't just the money that got me. There were names in those emails, people she was contacting who I'd never even heard of. One name kept popping up, Daniel. His name was all over the place, always tied to the biggest transfers, always with instructions to keep things quiet, or to wait until the situation is stable. As I kept scrolling, I found an email from just last week. Megan had written to him. "Meeting went well. Still no sign of suspicion. He's clueless." I had to stop right there. He's clueless. That was me. She was talking about me. It felt like someone had wrapped their hand around my throat and squeezed. 16 years of marriage, 16 years of building a life together, and all the while, she thought I was clueless, like some idiot. I knew I had to find out who this Daniel was. I couldn't just keep reading these half-baked truths and cryptic emails. I needed to see this guy for myself, figure out what he meant to Megan, and what role he played in all of this. Megan had mentioned she was going on a work trip that was supposed to last a couple of days, starting that very afternoon. This was my shot. She left the house, rolling her suitcase behind her, giving me a soft kiss and a smile before heading out the door. "I'll call you tonight," she said casually. I watched her car disappear down the road, and that's when I made my move. The name Daniel wasn't much to go on, but one of the emails had an address. It was a penthouse in one of those new shiny buildings that had popped up downtown over the last year. It was a long shot, but I didn't care. I needed to know who this guy was and what connection he had to Megan's secret money. I drove across town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. My heart was racing, and honestly, I had no clue what I was going to do when I got there. Knock on the door? Try to sneak in? Or just watch from afar? All I knew was that I had to see it for myself. The building was fancy, sleek glass and metal, the kind of place that screamed money. I walked into the lobby, glancing around for any sign of security, but the desk was empty. I saw the elevator doors closing and made a dash for it, slipping in just before they shut. I pressed the button for the top floor, the one matching the address from the email. When the doors slid open, the hallway was dead silent. There were only a few doors, spaced far apart, the kind of luxury where privacy was key. I made my way to the door with the matching number, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I heard it, laughter. A man's laugh, loud and carefree, followed by a voice I recognized all too well. It was Megan's. I froze. My whole world narrowed down to that door, and the sounds coming from behind it. Megan was supposed to be on a work trip, miles away from here. She wasn't supposed to be in a penthouse with some guy, laughing like it was all one big joke. I leaned in closer, practically pressing my ear to the door, trying to catch every word. "Don't worry, Danny," she said, her voice sweet and playful, the tone she used when she was trying to get her way. "He's not going to find out. He never even checks. I've got everything under control." I stepped back, my mind spinning, hands trembling. I wanted to kick that door in, confront them both right then and there, but something held me back. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that this was bigger than just cheating. This wasn't some simple affair. There was something calculated behind it all, something more sinister than just stepping out on me. I turned and left, my thoughts racing, my chest tightening with every step. Megan wasn't just lying to me, she was plotting planning something, and I still didn't fully understand what it was. But one thing was clear: whatever game she was playing, it wasn't just about another man. It was about control, and I wasn't going to let her have it anymore. When I got back home, I started putting together my own plans. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about flipping the script, about making sure that whatever she thought she could get away with, she'd regret. I didn't know exactly how yet, but that $10 million was going to be part of it. I didn't confront Megan when she got back that night. Instead, I let my mind sharpen, focused on the bigger picture. The betrayal I felt was turning into something else, something colder, more calculated. It was time to stop reacting, to stop being a bystander in the game she was playing. That $10 million Megan was hiding was going to be my leverage, but before I could use it, I needed to figure out exactly what she and Daniel were up to. The next day, I called up an old buddy of mine, Mark. We hadn't really stayed close since college, but he owed me one, and he worked in a business where secrets weren't exactly hard to come by. Mark was the kind of guy who could make records disappear, or even better, make them show up where you needed them. When I laid out what I needed, he didn't ask too many questions. He just let out a low whistle and said, "Man, this sounds like some serious S***T, but I got you." Within hours, I had everything. The real names behind those fake aliases, bank account numbers, transactions, and a whole lot of dirt on Daniel. Turns out, Daniel wasn't just some random fling. He was an investment advisor, at least on paper. But his history told a different story: fraud, money laundering, and all kinds of shady deals gone wrong. Daniel was the guy who made money for people who didn't want anyone knowing they had it. That's when it hit me: this wasn't just an affair. Megan wasn't in love with this guy. She was using him, just like she'd been using me. She'd been funneling money through him, using his know-how to hide it, to grow it through shady deals. She wasn't some naive wife. She was the mastermind behind it all. And that only made the betrayal cut deeper. All these years, she'd been living a double life, playing the perfect wife while quietly lining her pockets. My next step was to figure out how far this went. Mark got me into Megan's private accounts, and sure enough, she'd moved a ton of money in recent weeks. But that wasn't the worst of it. I found something else: payments to a law firm, and even a draft of a divorce agreement. One I had never seen before. It was cold, precise, and methodical. She wasn't just planning to leave me, she was going to take everything. There was a note attached to one of the transfers, written in her usual blunt style. "Need this finalized by next month. No mistakes." She was planning to blindside me. She was going to walk away with every last cent and leave me with nothing. My hands balled into fists as I read those words, anger burning through me like wildfire. I had given her everything: years of my life, my trust, my loyalty, and this was her plan? To strip me clean, take every dollar, and walk away with that fraud of a man? But if she thought she could get away with this, she was dead wrong. She had no clue what I knew now, and I was going to make her pay for every single lie she told, for every secret she'd kept. I waited until she came home that night. She strolled in like it was just another day, her face lit up with that same fake cheerfulness, like nothing had happened. "Hey, babe," she called out, dropping her keys into the bowl by the door. "You wouldn't believe how long the gallery meetings went today. I'm exhausted." I watched her move around the living room, her back turned to me, completely unaware of the rage boiling just beneath the surface. "You must be tired," I said, doing my best to keep my voice steady. "Long trip, I bet." She hesitated for a split second, glancing at me with a flicker of something in her eyes, almost like she was calculating her next move, but it vanished just as quickly, replaced by her usual warm smile. "Yeah, you know how it is," she said casually. And for the first time, I saw how easily she lied, how effortlessly she looked me in the eye and spun these stories. I nodded, pretending to care. "Why don't you go relax?" I suggested. "I'll get dinner started." She smiled again and leaned in to kiss me, her lips brushing mine like nothing had changed. But now, it felt wrong, repulsive, even. As she disappeared upstairs, I clenched my jaw. Every instinct in me wanted to drag her back down, to scream at her for what she'd done, but I knew better. Not yet. I waited until I heard the shower start running. Then I went to the safe in our bedroom closet, the one where we kept our passports, deeds, and other important papers. Inside was a USB drive I had planted earlier that day. On it was everything I had on her and Daniel: hidden accounts, transactions, emails, everything that tied them together in their dirty scheme. This drive was my ticket, my leverage. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to take back control of my life. Then I saw something else in the safe, something I hadn't noticed before. It was a small black notebook tucked behind some old files. I pulled it out and flipped it open, and my breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just any notebook, it was a ledger. Inside were names, amounts, and dates. A record of every transaction Megan had made, every person she had dealt with. Next to each name was a note, something she was holding over them, a piece of leverage she had on them. This wasn't just about the money. Megan had been blackmailing people. She turned her little fortune into a web of favors, secrets, and threats. I stared at the pages, feeling the full weight of her betrayal crash down on me. Megan wasn't just lying to me, she was running a whole criminal operation right out of our house. I heard the water turn off upstairs, and I knew my time was running short. I quickly slipped the notebook back into the safe, locked it, and tucked the USB drive into my pocket. A few minutes later, she came downstairs, her hair wrapped in a towel, with a relaxed smile on her face. "So, what's for dinner?" she asked, like everything was perfectly normal. I looked at her, this woman I had loved for so many years, and for the first time, I didn't feel sad or heartbroken. I felt something colder, more calculated. "Something special," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just for us." As she turned away, I knew exactly what I had to do. She thought she was in control, thought she had it all figured out. But now, I had the truth. Soon enough, she was going to learn just how dangerous it was to underestimate me. The next day, my world revolved around one thing: preparation. The anger and heartbreak were still there, but I used them like fuel, stoking the fire inside me and making every decision clear. I couldn't afford a single misstep, and I definitely wasn't about to let Megan know I was onto her, not yet. I took a leave of absence from work, telling my boss I had some family issues to deal with. It wasn't far from the truth, and he owed me enough favors not to pry. I needed time to make sure everything was in place. Mark, my old friend, helped me dig deeper. He uncovered Daniel's entire history, connections to some pretty nasty characters. Men whose names were whispered in backrooms, always attached to dirty deals. Daniel wasn't just a fraud, he was mixed up with organized crime. But I needed one more thing: a face-to-face meeting with this guy. It was time to let Daniel know I wasn't clueless anymore. I found out where Daniel worked, one of those fancy investment offices downtown, the kind with tinted glass and security guards. I put on my best suit, the one I hadn't worn since Megan's gallery opening 2 years ago, and walked into the building. The receptionist sized me up immediately, probably assuming I was some new client looking to invest. I played along. "Good morning," I said with a polite smile. "I'm here to see Daniel Sharp. He's expecting me." She nodded, flipping through her appointment book, and before she could say anything I added, "Tell him it's about Megan. He'll understand." That got her attention. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced up at me. "One moment, sir." She picked up the phone, lowering her voice as she spoke into the receiver. I stood there, heart pounding, but my face stayed calm and composed. After a few tense moments, she gestured toward the elevator. "Mr. Sharp is on the 5th floor. You can go up." The elevator ride felt longer than it was, each second dragging out like minutes. When the doors opened, I stepped into a hallway lined with expensive, abstract art. Those kinds of paintings that look like someone splashed random paint but probably cost more than my car. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. I walked toward it, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and knocked once before pushing it open. Daniel was seated at a large, polished desk. His eyes widened slightly when he saw me. He was younger than I expected, with slicked back hair and a permanent smirk that hovered just on the edge of insincerity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "You're Daniel Sharp, right?" I said in a low, controlled voice. "I believe you know my wife, Megan." For a moment I saw it, the flicker of recognition, the slight tightening of his jaw. He tried to play it off, leaning back in his chair, that fake smile creeping back onto his face. "I'm sorry, I think you're mistaken," he said, avoiding eye contact. "No mistake," I replied, pulling the USB drive from my pocket and holding it up for him to see. "I've got everything, Daniel, the accounts, the emails, the transfers. I know exactly what you and Megan have been doing." His face went pale, the smug expression vanishing in an instant. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but you can't just come in here and—" I cut him off, stepping closer, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. "I'm the man whose life you've been messing with, and I'm here to tell you that it stops today. I don't care what kind of games you've been playing with Megan, or what schemes you've got going, but I do care about that $10 million. Daniel's eyes widened even further. He was scared now, and I could see the wheels turning in his head, calculating his next move. "This isn't just about the money," he finally said, his voice trembling. "There are people involved, people you really don't want to mess with," Daniel said, his voice shaking a bit. "Maybe," I replied with a cold smile. "But here's the thing, Daniel, I'm not scared of them. In fact, I'm betting those same people you're so worried about are going to be a whole lot more interested in what you've been doing behind their backs." I leaned in closer, staring him down. "Unless, of course, you help me. You're gonna tell Megan the deal's gone south, that the money's been frozen, and that everything's on hold. You're gonna make her panic, and when she does, she'll come running, right into the trap I've set." Daniel swallowed hard, the fear written all over his face now. He was trapped, and he knew it. "And if I refuse?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Then I send everything I've got to those people you're so terrified of. I'll make sure they know how you've been skimming off the top, playing both sides. Trust me, they won't be nearly as forgiving as I am." He stared at me for what felt like a long time, his face a mixture of desperation and defeat. Finally he nodded, his shoulders slumping. "All right," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "I'll do it." I stepped back and slipped the USB drive back into my pocket. "Good," I said. "And just so we're clear, if you try to warn her, if you make one wrong move, I'll make sure you're the one left with nothing. Got it?" He nodded again, and without another word, I turned and walked out of his office. Once the door clicked shut behind me, I let out a long breath, my hands trembling a little. It had worked. I had him. Now all I needed was for Megan to take the bait. That evening, when I got home, Megan was in the kitchen, humming to herself, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, flashing me that bright smile. "Hey, babe," she said. "How was your day?" I smiled back, keeping my voice light. "Oh, you know, the usual. Nothing too exciting." She nodded and took another sip of wine, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit her. I watched her for a moment, the way she moved, the way she looked at me like I was just part of the furniture, completely unaware. It was almost laughable how she still thought she was in control. But soon, she'd learn the truth. Soon everything she had built, every lie she'd spun, would come crashing down. And I'd be right there to see it. The trap was set, and now, it was just a matter of waiting. The anticipation had me on edge. Every nerve in my body was firing, and I kept a close eye on Megan over the next few days, pretending everything was normal while keeping tabs on her every move. Daniel had done his part. He contacted Megan and fed her the story I'd given him, accounts frozen, authorities snooping around. It was the kind of news that would make her panic. And sure enough, she started to crack. At first, it was subtle. She paced around the kitchen more than usual, her eyes constantly flicking to her phone. Her smile was tighter, and she spoke less, like every word was a struggle. She'd disappear for hours, coming back with vague excuses about problems at the gallery. But I knew better. She was scrambling, trying to figure out what went wrong, trying to fix something she didn't realize was already beyond repair. On the third day, it happened. I came home from running a quick errand and found her in the living room, phone pressed to her ear, her voice sharp and panicked. I stayed out of sight, listening. "What do you mean it's over?" she hissed, her voice low and frantic. "No, Daniel, you can't just pull out now. I need that money back. Do you hear me? You owe me." There was a long pause, and I could hear her breathing, heavy and uneven. I could imagine Daniel on the other end, just as scared of her as he was of the people I'd threatened him with. Megan had always been good at bending people to her will, but this time, her own games were catching up with her. She ended the call, tossing her phone onto the couch with a frustrated growl. She paced back and forth, her hands running through her hair, her eyes wild with desperation. It was a side of her I had never seen before. Then, as if something clicked in her mind, she grabbed her bag and rushed out the door before I could even react. I followed her. I had planned for this moment, knowing she'd eventually make a move. I knew exactly where she was headed, her sister Emma. Emma lived across town in a small, cluttered house, the total opposite of Megan's taste. It was cozy, with an overgrown garden, a safe haven for Megan when things went sideways. I parked a block away, watching as Megan knocked frantically on Emma's door, her face twisted in frustration. Emma opened it, her eyes widening in surprise, and quickly let Megan in. I waited a few minutes, then made my way to the door. I didn't bother knocking. I turned the handle and walked right in. What greeted me was almost laughable. Megan was sitting on Emma's couch, her head in her hands, her face pale. Emma stood next to her, awkward and concerned, resting a hand on Megan's shoulder. They both looked up as I stepped inside, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Megan's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing her face. "John," she stammered, standing up quickly, her voice cracking just a little. "What are you doing here?" I gave her a smile, one I knew didn't reach my eyes. "I think it's time we had a little chat, don't you?" Emma looked between us, confusion written all over her face. "What's going on?" she asked softly, barely above a whisper. "Megan, is everything okay?" Megan opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was scrambling, trying to figure out a story to cover this, but I wasn't about to give her that chance. "Emma," I said calmly, almost in a friendly tone, "why don't you take a seat? You might want to hear this too." Emma hesitated, eyes wide, but she slowly sank into the armchair across from Megan. I watched Megan closely as her face cycled through emotions, fear, anger, and finally, that cold mask sliding into place. "You've been lying to me, Megan," I said, keeping my voice steady. "About a lot of things, Daniel, the money, everything." I pulled the USB drive from my pocket, holding it up so she could see. "I know about the accounts, the transfers, the money you've been hiding. I know what you've been planning." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then Megan let out a harsh, bitter laugh that cut through the tension in the room. "You don't know anything," she snapped, her voice filled with venom. "You're just trying to scare me." I stepped closer, locking eyes with her. "You want to test me, Megan? Because I'm done playing the clueless husband. I've got every email, every transaction. I know you've been working with Daniel to stash that money. I know about your little plan to leave me with nothing. It's over." Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Megan, is this true?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Megan's eyes flicked to Emma and then back to me. For a split second, I saw panic flicker in her expression, the realization that she was cornered. But then she turned to Emma, her face softening, her voice taking on a fake tone of sorrow. "He's lying, Em," she said, her voice breaking. "You know him. He's always been jealous, always suspicious. He's making this all up." "Enough." My voice was sharp, cutting through her act. "I have proof, Megan. It's not some wild story. You've been planning this for years. You were going to leave me, take everything, and disappear with Daniel. You think I don't know about the divorce papers you've been drafting?" Megan's face went pale, the color draining from her cheeks. Her eyes darted to Emma, who looked like she'd just been hit. "Divorce?" Emma whispered, her voice cracking. "Megan, what is he talking about?" For the first time, Megan had no words. She opened her mouth, then shut it, her hands trembling at her sides. The mask had fallen, and I saw her for what she truly was, cold, calculating, and exposed. I turned to Emma. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I said, my tone softening slightly. "But your sister's been lying to both of us. She's been stealing, manipulating, and planning to betray everyone around her. Now, it's time she faces the consequences." Emma stared at Megan, tears welling in her eyes. "Is this true?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Were you really going to leave him? Take everything?" Megan looked between me and Emma, and for a brief moment, I saw something that resembled regret. But then her face hardened. "You don't understand," she spat, her voice filled with disdain. "You never understood. I did what I had to do. You think I was just going to sit there, living that boring life forever? I deserved more. I deserve more." I shook my head, stepping back. "You had everything, Megan. And now you're going to lose it all." She glared at me, her eyes narrowing to slits. "You think you've won? You think you're the hero here?" she hissed. "You're just as pathetic as ever, John." I turned away, her words sliding off me. They didn't have any power over me anymore. "Emma," I said, my voice calm and measured, "I think it's best if you take some time away from her. There are things I need to handle, and it's going to get messy." Emma nodded, her eyes wide, still in shock. She looked at Megan, then back at me, and finally stood up, her hands shaking. I need some air," she whispered. Without another word, she hurried out of the room. The door slammed shut behind her, and suddenly, it was just me and Megan. The woman I had loved now stood before me as a stranger. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel any love, any pain, or even loss. All I felt was the cold satisfaction of knowing I was finally free from her lies. "You're going to regret this," Megan said, her voice low and dangerous. I gave her a cold smile, one that didn't reach my eyes. "No, Megan, the only one who's going to regret anything here is you." As I turned and walked away, I knew this was just the beginning. Megan had built her entire world on lies, manipulation, and greed. Now it was time to watch it all crumble, and I was going to make sure I had the perfect seat for her downfall. The air between us felt electric, buzzing with tension. When Emma left, the whole room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in around Megan and me. She stood there, her hands clenched, trying to hold on to that defiant expression, but I could see the fear creeping in. The control she'd held onto for so long was slipping away, and all that was left was a raw, desperate version of her I hadn't seen before. I didn't give her a chance to speak. I walked past her into the living room where I'd already set up my final move. On the coffee table, I had laid out copies of the documents I'd pulled from her secret stash: divorce papers, account details, blackmail notes. The whole mess of her betrayals was there for her to see. Megan followed me, her eyes widening as she saw the evidence spread out in front of her like a buffet of her lies. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice strained. I could hear the tremble underneath her words. "You think this changes anything? You think you have power over me now?" I didn't respond right away. I picked up one of the papers, a ledger, showing the transactions she'd orchestrated through Daniel. I held it up so she could see the dates, the amounts, the aliases she used to cover her tracks. "You've been lying for years, Megan," I said evenly. "And this? This is what you've built with all those lies. A hidden fortune, something you thought would save you from this life, from me, from everything you decided wasn't good enough anymore." She laughed, but it was brittle, almost hysterical. "You really think you're some kind of detective, don't you?" she sneered. "You think because you found some papers and heard a few phone calls, you have any idea what I've been dealing with. I did this for us." She jabbed her finger at the documents, her hand shaking. "I did this because you were too small-minded to dream bigger, to see what we could have had if you just let me handle things." I shook my head, a bitter smile pulling at my lips. "For us? Is that what you tell yourself, Megan? Because last I checked, for us didn't include secret meetings, an affair with a criminal, and $10 million hidden in offshore accounts." She opened her mouth to reply, but I cut her off, stepping closer, my voice dropping. "You used me. You used our marriage as a front while you played your games, hid money, and made dirty deals. You were planning to leave me broke. You wanted to strip me of everything and run off with that scumbag Daniel. My voice rose, the months of bottled-up rage finally breaking loose. You think I didn't notice the way you looked at me these past months? The way you smirked every time I believed one of your lies? Megan flinched, but she didn't back down. She squared her shoulders, lifting her chin in defiance. I did what I had to do. You don't understand the kind of pressure I was under. Daniel was supposed to be a partner, someone to help me move the money quietly, someone who knew how to work the system. You think I enjoyed it? Being with him? She spat the words out, her eyes narrowing. I did it because I had no choice. You wouldn't have survived in the world I wanted to build. You're too weak. I felt something snap inside me, a cold finality washing over my anger. I took a step back, shaking my head. You're wrong, Megan. I'm not weak. I was trusting. I believed in you, and you took that trust and twisted it into something ugly. You thought you could get away with all of it, that I'd never catch on. But here we are. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, tapping the screen a few times. The call connected, and I held it up, the speaker echoing as Mark's voice came through. Everything's in place, John, Mark said, his voice steady. Just say the word, and the documents go out. Megan's face went pale, her eyes widening with genuine fear for the first time. What are you doing? She whispered, her voice cracking. I stared at her, letting the silence hang between us, watching her expression shift from shock to desperation. All your associates, I said slowly, savoring the moment. The people you've been blackmailing, they're about to find out just how much you've been hiding from them. Every secret, every transaction, every lie. It's all going public. Your empire, your little fortress of secrets, it's all coming down. No! She screamed, lunging at me, her face twisted in panic. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, but I didn't flinch. You can't do this! You'll destroy everything! You'll destroy me! Her voice broke, and tears streamed down her face as she clung to me, all the pride and defiance crumbling away in an instant. Please, John, she whispered, barely audible now, her hands trembling against my arm. You don't understand. They'll come after me. You don't know the kind of people Daniel's involved with. If this gets out, I won't survive it. Please. I looked down at her, the woman I had loved for so many years, now broken and pleading at my feet. But all I felt was a cold emptiness. She had taken everything from me, my trust, my love, my sense of safety. She had twisted it all into something vile. I was done protecting her. You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me, Megan, I said, my voice flat, emotionless. I turned back to the phone and took a deep breath. Mark, send it. No, 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 she cried, her voice rising in desperation, her grip tightening on my arm. But it was too late. I heard Mark's confirmation through the line, just a simple, "It's done." I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket. Megan sank to the floor, her sobs filling the room. Her hands clawed at her hair, as if she could somehow pull herself back from the edge she had already fallen over. I stood there, watching her, feeling nothing. This was the end of the woman I had loved, the one who had once been my partner, my confidant. But this version of Megan, the schemer, the liar, she had never really been mine. She had been a stranger all along, and now, she was finally facing the consequences of her own actions. Pack your things, I said quietly, turning towards the door. I want you out of the house by tonight. She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot, her face twisted in a mixture of hatred and sorrow. You'll regret this, she whispered, her voice shaking. I swear you'll regret it. I paused at the door, glancing back at her one last time. No, Megan, I said, my voice steady. The only thing I regret is not seeing the real you sooner. And with that, I walked out, leaving her behind, her sobs echoing through the empty house. The life we had built together, the lies she had spun, the empire she had tried to create, it was all in ruins now. And for the first time in months, I felt free. I drove away from Emma's house with a strange, unsettling calm in my chest. The storm had passed, the confrontation was over, and all that remained was the wreckage of what used to be my life. Megan's sobs still echoed in my mind, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else, someone I no longer knew. I pulled over to the side of a quiet road, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I needed a moment to process everything, to let the reality of what I had just done sink in. I had torn down every lie, exposed every secret, and watched as the life Megan had built around deception crumbled. There was a kind of satisfaction in it, but it felt hollow. This wasn't a victory. It was just an ending. As I sat there, my phone buzzed. It was Mark again. "Hey man." His voice came through cautious. "Just wanted to let you know, the emails went through. Every contact on that list got what they needed to see. Some of them are already responding. It's intense." "Intense?" I repeated, my voice distant. "Yeah, I don't think Megan's going to have many friends left in her world after this," he said. "I even heard from one of my guys that a few of them are already scrambling, trying to cut ties, cover their own tracks. She really stirred up some nasty stuff, John." I closed my eyes and nodded to myself. It was exactly what I had expected. Megan's empire wasn't just a personal one. It was built on the backs of people who had just as much to lose as she did. And now that everything was coming to light, they were going to do whatever it took to protect themselves, even if that meant throwing her under the bus. "Thanks, Mark," I said, my voice heavy. "I appreciate everything you've done." There was a pause, and then Mark spoke again, his voice softer. "You okay, man? I mean, really. I know this wasn't easy." I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't know if okay is the right word," I said finally. "But I feel like I did what I had to do. And now it's time to figure out what comes next." Mark was quiet for a moment, then he sighed. "Well, if you need anything else, you know where to find me. Just take care of yourself, alright?" I hung up, leaning back in my seat, letting the silence of the car settle around me. What did come next? The truth was, I had no idea. For so long, my life had been tied to Megan, every decision shaped by the person I thought she was. Now, all of that was gone, and I was left with nothing but the pieces. The next few days passed in a blur. Megan had left the house, just like I'd asked. When I returned that night, the place was empty. Her clothes were gone, her presence erased, as if she had never been there. I walked through the house, the silence pressing in on me. It felt like both a relief and a loss. This was supposed to be our home, the place where we built memories, where we raised a family. Now, it was just an empty shell, stripped of everything it once meant. I tried to distract myself, to keep busy. I started clearing out the things Megan had left behind, photos, trinkets, all the little pieces of our life that no longer held any meaning. I packed them into boxes, one after another, until the house felt bare, the echoes of our past fading into nothingness. But even in the silence, there were still ripples from the bomb I had dropped. The phone calls started coming, friends, acquaintances, people who had heard rumors but didn't know the full story. They wanted to know what had happened, why Megan had suddenly disappeared, why her name was now circulating in whispers around town. I ignored most of the calls, letting them go straight to voicemail. I wasn't interested in explaining myself to people who had never known the real truth about our marriage. They had only seen the version of us Megan wanted them to see, the perfect couple that had it all. They didn't know the lies, the betrayals, the ugly reality hidden beneath the surface. But there was one call I couldn't ignore, my lawyer. He'd received word that Megan had filed an injunction, trying to block me from accessing our shared accounts, claiming I was trying to ruin her financially. The irony hit me so hard I almost laughed. She was the one who had tried to destroy me, and now, in her desperation, she was trying to play the victim. It was classic Megan, always twisting the narrative, always finding a way to come out on top. The next day, I met with my lawyer. He was a sharp, no-nonsense kind of guy, exactly who I needed in this situation. He went over the paperwork with me, laying out Megan's claims. I could feel the anger simmering just beneath the surface as I listened. "She doesn't have a leg to stand on," he said, his tone dismissive. "Given what you've uncovered, it's clear she's just trying to cover her tracks. We can counter this easily, but you need to be prepared." If she's desperate enough to pull this, she might try something more. I nodded, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. Do whatever you need to do, I replied. I just want this to be over. As I left his office, I realized just how exhausted I was, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. This whole fight had drained me, taken everything I had. All I wanted now was peace. I wanted to move on, to leave Megan and her lies behind, but it seemed like she was determined to drag this out, to make it as painful as possible. That night, sitting alone in the living room, the emptiness of the house pressing in on me, I thought about what I really wanted. Revenge had driven me this far, the need to expose Megan, to take back the power she had stolen from me. But now that it was done, what was left? I didn't want to keep fighting, to keep reliving the pain she had caused. What I wanted was freedom, from her, from the anger, from the past. I picked up my phone and dialed Mark. When he answered, I spoke before he could say anything. I need one more favor, I said. I need you to help me make sure she can't touch me or anything I own ever again. I don't care what it takes. I just want her out of my life for good. Mark was silent for a moment. Then, he let out a slow breath. All right, John, I can do that. But you know this won't be easy. She's not going to let go without a fight. I know, I said, my voice steady. But I'm done being afraid of her. I'm done letting her control my life. When I hung up, I felt a sense of resolve settle over me. This was the final step, the last piece of the puzzle. I was going to make sure Megan had no more power over me, no more control, no more ways to hurt me. She had taken everything from me once, but now, I was taking it back. And when this was all over, I would finally be free. Free to rebuild, to start over, to figure out who I was without her shadow hanging over me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope, a spark that reminded me that life could be more than just survival, more than just a battle against betrayal. It could be mine again. I woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in a long time. The conversation with Mark had solidified my decision. This was it, the final step toward freedom. I spent the day contacting my lawyer, setting up meetings, making sure every legal loophole Megan might try to exploit was sealed shut. My entire life had been thrown into chaos by her deceit, and now I was going to restore order, no matter what it took. The house, though empty, began to feel less like a reminder of what I had lost and more like a blank slate. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was starting to feel like peace. I packed more of Megan's things, leaving the boxes by the door for her to collect, though I doubted she'd have the nerve to come back here anytime soon. Then, an unexpected phone call came through. The number was unfamiliar, and I hesitated before answering. John, a man's voice said, smooth and self-assured. This is Daniel. I was taken aback. The last thing I expected was for Daniel to reach out to me directly. My grip tightened around the phone, the old anger rising up again. What do you want? I said, my voice colder than I intended. Before you hang up, just listen, Daniel said quickly, a note of urgency in his tone. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. I paused, curiosity wrestling with my instinct to tell him to go to hell. You've got 2 minutes, I said flatly. Look, I know you're angry. You have every right to be, he began, and I could hear the anxiety behind his polished exterior. But things have gotten complicated. Megan's not taking this well, and she's not going to go down quietly. She's reached out to some dangerous people I thought I could keep her away from. She's planning something, John. Something that could get both of us in serious trouble. A chill ran down my spine. I had expected Megan to fight back, but this, reaching out to dangerous people. It was as if she was willing to risk everything to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. What kind of trouble? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The kind that involves cleaning up loose ends, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a whisper. She wants to get rid of all the evidence, including me. And if you get in her way, you too. I'm telling you this because I want out. I never signed up for this level of risk. I thought it was just about money, but it's getting darker, fast. My mind raced. Megan had always been calculating, but I hadn't realized she would go this far. Threatening me was one thing, but reaching out to people who handle problems permanently? She was out of control. Desperate. Dangerous. "What do you want from me, Daniel?" I finally asked. "Why tell me this?" "I'm trying to save my own skin, all right?" he said, his polished tone gone, replaced by raw fear. "I know people who can help me disappear, but I need some leverage. I need to give them something that shows I'm not a threat, that I'm out of the game. And I need you to stay out of it. Don't make things worse for me." I clenched my jaw, my mind spinning. This was spiraling into a level of danger I hadn't anticipated. I'd wanted to expose Megan and take back my life, but now the stakes were higher than I had imagined. "I don't trust you," I said finally. "You've been lying from the start, and now you expect me to believe you just want out." "I don't care if you trust me," Daniel shot back. "But I swear, John, I don't want anything to do with this anymore. I'm leaving, but if you keep pushing, she's going to do something drastic. I'm giving you a chance to walk away, to let this end without anyone getting hurt." I could hear the desperation in his voice, and for a moment, I considered it. Maybe walking away was the best option. Let Daniel vanish, let Megan face whatever mess she had created. But then the anger flared up again, the thought of her still out there, still scheming, still willing to hurt anyone to get what she wanted. "Give me proof," I said after a long pause. "Proof that she's planning something. Otherwise, I don't believe a word you're saying." Daniel was silent for a moment. "Fine," he said. "Meet me tonight. There's an old warehouse on Canal Street, near the river. I'll bring everything I have. But you come alone, and don't try anything stupid. This is your only chance, John." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at my phone, my heart pounding. A meeting at a warehouse. It sounded like a setup. The kind of place where everything goes wrong in a crime drama. But if Daniel had proof, if Megan was planning to take things to a dangerous level, I needed to know. I spent the rest of the afternoon going over every possibility. I wasn't naive. I knew this could easily be a trap. Daniel could be trying to lure me out to deal with me the way Megan wanted, but there was also a chance he was telling the truth. That he was as scared as he sounded, and this was my chance to end it. As night fell, I made my decision. I drove to Canal Street, parking a few blocks away, the river shimmering under the moonlight. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and abandoned, the kind of place that sent a chill down your spine even before you stepped inside. I walked slowly, my senses on high alert, every creak of the old building echoing around me. I spotted Daniel standing near a stack of crates, his figure barely visible in the dim light. He looked over as I approached, his eyes wide with nerves. "You came," he said, a mix of relief and fear in his voice. "Let's get this over with," I said, keeping my distance. Daniel nodded, reaching into his coat and pulling out a folder. "This is everything," he said, holding it out to me. "Every plan, every contact she's made, it's all there. She's not just going to let this go, John. She's too deep in." I stepped closer, reaching for the folder, and that's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps, fast and heavy, coming from behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I turned, just in time to see two men emerge from the shadows, their faces obscured, their intentions unmistakable. Daniel's eyes went wide. "I didn't know," he started, but it was too late. One of the men lunged at him while the other came straight for me. Instinct took over. I dodged to the side, my mind barely processing what was happening. One of the men swung at me, and pain exploded in my side as I staggered back. But adrenaline kicked in, and I fought back, grappling with him as the folder slipped from Daniel's hand, scattering papers across the floor. "Run!" Daniel shouted, panic in his voice. I saw him break free and sprint toward the door. I didn't hesitate. I followed, my breath coming in ragged gasps, chaos echoing behind me. We burst out of the warehouse into the cold night air, which hit me like a slap. I ran without looking back, my mind focused on one thing: getting away, surviving. Daniel was ahead of me, his silhouette barely visible in the darkness. I pushed myself to keep up, my legs burning, my lungs screaming for air. Finally, we reached the riverbank, stumbling to a stop, both of us gasping for breath. Daniel turned to me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "They're not going to stop," he said, his voice shaking. "She's not going to stop." I looked at him, the realization sinking in. This wasn't over. Megan was willing to go to any length to protect herself, and now we were both targets. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not now. Not ever. "We're going to end this," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "But we do it my way. No more running. No more hiding. We take her down, and we make sure she can never hurt anyone again." Daniel nodded, fear still in his eyes, but there was something else too, determination. He was in this now, whether he wanted to be or not. And together, we were going to finish what she had started. The night was far from over, and the battle ahead was going to be dangerous. But I had survived Megan's betrayal, her lies, her attempts to destroy me. And now, it was time to fight back. This time, I wasn't going to stop until she was finished. The riverbank was quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city and our heavy breathing. I stared at Daniel, his face pale under the moonlight, his eyes desperate. There was no running anymore. Only a direct confrontation would end this nightmare. We decided to move fast. The longer we waited, the more dangerous it became. Megan's connections were real, and now they knew we were a threat. I didn't have much time, and neither did Daniel. We had to finish what we started, end her web of lies and make sure she could never reach us again. That night, I drove back to my house with Daniel in the passenger seat. He was a wreck. His hands shook, and he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting Megan's thugs to emerge from the shadows at any moment. "She'll stop at nothing, John," he muttered. "You don't know her like I do." I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles widening. "I know her well enough. I know what she's capable of. But she doesn't know me anymore either. She thinks I'm weak, that I'll just sit back and let her destroy everything. Tonight we end this." The plan was simple: force Megan out of hiding, expose her, and leave her with no escape. The documents Daniel had brought to the warehouse, though scattered and incomplete, were enough to tie her to the dangerous people she had threatened to use against us. I called Mark, and we set things in motion. This time, it wasn't just about emails. It was about turning her own allies against her. We had what we needed: proof of her betrayal, her hidden accounts, her dealings with criminals no one in their right mind would want to cross. If we could get this information into the right hands, to people already suspicious of Megan's double-dealing, we could cut her off completely, making her untouchable in the worst possible way. Even the kinds of people Megan was involved with had a code, and in their world, breaking trust was the ultimate sin. Mark worked quickly. By morning, the information was in the hands of those who mattered, the powerful players in Megan's shady network. And then we waited. It didn't take long. Megan stormed into the house later that day, her face flushed with fury, her eyes wild. She didn't knock. She didn't even hesitate. "John!" she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "Where are you?" I was ready. I stepped into the hallway, watching her, feeling nothing but cold resolve. Megan looked different now, disheveled, desperate. This wasn't the composed, confident woman I had once known. This was someone on the verge of losing everything, and she knew it. "You did this?" she hissed, stepping closer, her hands trembling. "You think you can just ruin me? You think you can take everything from me and walk away?" I stood my ground, my expression calm. "You did this to yourself, Megan. You lied, you stole, and now everyone knows the truth. You wanted to play a dangerous game, and now it's come back to bite you." She laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "You have no idea what you've done," she said, her voice laced with venom. "They're coming for me, John. And if they can't get to me, they'll come for you. You're not safe. You never were." I took a deep breath, stepping closer, my voice steady. "Maybe, but at least now I'm free from you. You can't hurt me anymore, Megan. You can't manipulate me, and you sure as hell can't control me." Her face twisted in anger, but behind it, I could see something else: fear. "You think you've won?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You think this is over? Before I could respond, Daniel appeared behind me, pale but determined. "It is over, Megan," he said firmly. "We've made sure of it. Your contacts have turned on you. They know you're a liability, that you can't be trusted. You're finished." She stared at him, shock widening her eyes. For a moment, there was silence, and then she lunged at Daniel, her face contorted with rage. "You traitor!" she screamed. I stepped between them, grabbing her arms and holding her back. "Enough!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty house. "It's over, Megan. You're done." She struggled for a moment, her breath ragged, but then she went still. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and something else, something that almost resembled regret. "You could have had everything," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We could have had it all." I shook my head, loosening my grip on her arms. "No, Megan. What you wanted wasn't real. It was all built on lies, and I'm done living in your fantasy." For a long moment, she just stared at me, her eyes searching mine as if looking for something she had lost. Then, slowly, she stepped back, her shoulders slumping. The fight had drained out of her. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door. She paused for a moment, glancing back at me, her expression unreadable. "You'll regret this, John," she said quietly. "One day, you'll realize what you lost." I met her gaze, feeling nothing but cold emptiness. "Maybe," I replied. "But at least I'll know it was real." The door slammed shut behind her, and the house fell into silence. I stood there for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. It was over, really, truly over. Daniel let out a shaky breath, sinking onto the couch, his hands trembling. "What now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked around the empty house, the place that had once been filled with so many memories, both good and bad. "Now we move on," I said quietly. "We let her face the consequences of her actions, and we start over." Daniel nodded, though he still looked unsure. I didn't blame him. The path ahead was uncertain, full of unknowns, but it was a path I was ready to take. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over my life again. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles, negotiations, and dealing with the fallout from everything Megan had done. The people she had crossed were ruthless, and it wasn't long before word came back that she had fled. She left the city, maybe even the country. She was running now, just like she had tried to make me run. But I wasn't running anymore. I was staying. I was rebuilding. I sold the house. It was too full of ghosts, too many memories of a life that no longer existed. I found a small place on the outskirts of town, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could start fresh. Daniel vanished, just like he said he would, leaving no trace. I didn't blame him. He needed his own kind of freedom, and I hoped he found it. As for me, I was finally free, free from Megan, free from her lies, free from the life that had been built on deception. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of it all felt too much to bear. But each day, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger. I didn't know what the future held. Maybe I'd regret some of the choices I made. Maybe I'd even find myself missing the good moments I'd shared with Megan, the love that had once felt so real. But one thing was certain. I was done living in the shadows of someone else's lies. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I was ready to see what life had to offer on my own terms.